Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee A Million again, back at you with another edition of SPONGECOMS. This is for Season 1, Episode 9, Nature Pants and Opposite Day, both of which aired on September 11th, 1999. This is another case where people are a bit divided on exactly how good these episodes are, or if they're even bad episodes. I personally don't believe that. This will be mostly positive. But before I get into that, my question of the week this week is, what's a highly regarded episode that you dislike? There's no wrong answers, don't worry. Let me know and it might be featured on the show next week, at the end. Nature Pants was written by Paul Tibbett, Mark O'Hare, and Peter Burns. Pretty standard names by this point. And I think by this point they should have really gotten into exactly who SpongeBob is and exactly what he likes about his job and his life. And one of my problems with Nature Pants is that you can't really relate to SpongeBob throughout most of it. Like, he's a funny character, you can kind of relate to his emotions, but his journey is a bit of a mystery when you really think about it, because this opening dream sequence is fine, but I don't think it should justify the whole episode. Like, there should have been escalation to this, because after this, he decides, yep, I want to live in the wild now. I want to act like a jellyfish for the rest of my life. And sure, that is a very spontaneous thing that kids might do because of maybe a TV show. But still, I think we need a little bit more motivation for a cartoon protagonist. That's just my takeaway from this, and why SpongeBob isn't at his most reliable here as a main character. I mean, right after he throws a fire extinguisher at a thing. It's probably one of my favorite jokes of the episode. Like, regardless of how you feel about the story, the jokes in this episode are decent for the most part. And this action sequence is also really good. Nice use of color, nice use of lighting with the fire. And nice little payoff with SpongeBob shrinking into a little smoldering piece of sponge. But yeah, this is the scene of the episode that sort of establishes what SpongeBob's journey is, and it sets the episode out to be a mixed bag. Because SpongeBob wants to give up his industrial life for a life among the jellyfish. And thing is, by this point in the series, you've already got SpongeBob having his whole life centered around his job at the Krusty Krab and how much he admires his work and the joy it gives others, or the taste it gives others. And this is especially jarring if you've watched up to, say, Season 6, but even in Season 1, this is sort of odd that he'd suddenly give up his whole life just for this. The more I think about this episode, the more it is fitting for a Season 6 episode, plot-wise. Joke-wise, they're nothing alike. Season 1 is way funnier. But yeah, when you really read between the lines, it is kind of weird character-wise. But I will give it the plot this. There is some decent foreshadowing here with the jar of mayonnaise, and of course All Reliable, who both of these things come back later in this episode. But I especially like the use of the jar of mayonnaise because that's far less noticeable. The old phone books, unfortunately, are never referenced again, ever in the show. Not that we need phone books anymore, because even they have got shell phones. And here's All Reliable. He appears later again in the Pink Purloiner, about in Season 4, towards the end of Season 4. And it looks a little different there, but whatever, it's All Reliable. It's an old, reliable jellyfishing net. I'm fine with it, no matter how it looks. But still, it is very spontaneous that SpongeBob just wants to give up his life just to run away. But he is being mature about it. Like, he is saying goodbye to all his friends. Like, I'm sure if this was a Season 6 episode, he'd just cry off. However, this would share similarities in terms of him taking off his pants. After this little 11 minutes joke, I'll talk about that. 11 minutes is the average runtime for a SpongeBob episode, and they sometimes reference it in the show, like in this, Club SpongeBob, Planet of the Jellyfish, if I remember correctly. And yeah, I do like it. It's the easiest fourth wall break to do because it isn't really directly referencing the audience. I'm sure this takes place over a lot more than 11 minutes, so Sandy's ballpark of a week is a little... logarithmically, it makes more sense. But yeah, SpongeBob being naked throughout most of this episode, due to the way that SpongeBob characters are design-wise, nudity is almost never a problem in the show. Of course, when we get to Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy in season 7, that's going to be a lot different. But here, this establishes well that we don't need to worry about like censorship or anything when SpongeBob's naked, because there's nothing to hide. Like, I'm sure if you think too hard about the holes, your childhood will be ruined. I apologize. But let's continue, because this little bit sets up that SpongeBob doesn't really fit in with the jellyfish, but he continues to stay here for at least until the end of today. We don't know if this is set over multiple days at all. It probably is, because when you take into account how difficult his night is, it's most likely his first night. But yeah, I think that this is the best Patrick gets in this episode. This, just him reading off the script and even reading the actions. It's downhill after this, because Patrick is also pretty unreliable as a Deuterangorist. Sorry, that wasn't... I didn't pronounce that correctly. Spontaneity, you know. Thing is, Patrick is alright here in the picnic scene, but his sanity does sort of deplete the longer SpongeBob is away from society. And that... yeah, I don't really relate to Crazy Patrick the best when he's just speaking in the first person. He's ironically a bit more animal than SpongeBob in that case. Like, if this is an episode about animal behavior, then it could have been a teensy bit more about it. But instead, Patrick's the only one who's remotely, like, different. And here we see SpongeBob squiggly, Adventure Time style arms. There were some SpongeBob writers who went on to do Adventure Time, like Meriwether Williams, and I guess they thought, this'll fit into that show's art style as well. I'm not a big fan of Adventure Time, but that's just a nice little tidbit. And here we see the mayonnaise jar, and Old Reliable earlier. Just wanted to talk over Patrick being crazy, because this isn't my favorite thing in the world. However, in defense of it, it is pretty mimetic. In general, this episode is very mimetic, but there's a scene coming up here that you saw all the time on Twitter in mid-2018. 2 scenes, actually. SpongeBob naked, breathing in and out, and also Patrick hanging from a ceiling with an evil grin, which I've made the thumbnail for this episode of SpongeComs. And these are 2 very silly, funny scenes when you take them out of context and put them into new contexts, which is what memes are nowadays. And I also like the Patrick thing, the evil Patrick thing, outside of the context of this episode, because he is being a starfish in this regard. Like, they're not just weird characters, they are animals, undersea animals. And I think a little gag like that goes a long way in showing that off. And here Patrick leaves the episode again, thankfully, so we can be off to the races with SpongeBob again. Odd thing about this episode's pacing, they have 2 Patrick scenes in a row, and then 2 extra scenes of SpongeBob failing to acclimate to jellyfish culture in a row. And I think it would have helped the flow of the story if this in the jellyfish hive scene came first, and then Patrick chasing him, and then the night. That's just me, though. It would show further escalation of the reason SpongeBob doesn't belong here. Jellyfish are bees in this episode. Last time they were pests like hedgehogs, I gave an example back in Jellyfish Jam. And here they're bees. They have a bee hive. I think that makes sense. Jellyfish jelly, that is sort of a liquidy substance that you can substitute for honey, as honey. As much as I don't like this scene in the cave, it's got good lighting. The cave effects are pretty nice. Whoever drew it, I want it on my wall. That's a good thing about Season 1's animation, is that when it's really good, you have the chance to physically own it, because it was made on cells. And I'm sure if you do like this scene in the cave, then if you fork out hundreds of dollars, then you can have it on your wall and it'll slowly deteriorate over time. And this is the point where SpongeBob officially gives up trying to be a jellyfish. Way, way, way too late to take seriously. I think in this episode, SpongeBob is more of a substitute for a kid. Like, an 18-year-old or over wouldn't really, oh my gosh, that little floral structure at Bikini Bottom right there, you never see that again. That's only in this episode and maybe a few other season 1 episodes, but I love it so much. It gives Bikini Bottom an extra layer of identity. Just have to point out something more blatant like that. And also Squid's lights on, despite him not being in there, in his house. Little things like that I've got to point out because this ending's really slow, but still some background things are pretty interesting to talk about. And as iffy as this episode is, this little thing at the end where they throw together a welcome back party for SpongeBob after he threw his life away, this is pretty sweet. I do enjoy it. And it's kind of odd seeing season 1 SpongeBob with his Krusty Krab hat on, but not his pants. I'm sure that's just the weirdness of it. But it's also kind of fun when he puts it back on and hugs Squidward. Would have been a bit weirder if he kept his pants off and hugged Squidward, but okay, let's just... Nature Pants. Pretty meh episode all around. It's pretty strange in places, not for the best reasons, but it is a SpongeBob episode. It's a little excusable at some points. Let me know what you think. And Opposite Day was written by Chuck Clean, Jay Lender, and Mr. Lawrence. Chuck Clean has a very interesting history with SpongeBob because some crew members on SpongeBob started out as storyboard artists or directors and went up in the ranks and became writers on episodes, like Zeus Service, for example. That was an example. It's a very popular example because it kind of proved how the writing changed around the time he came on board. Chuck Clean is the polar opposite of that. Chuck Clean was a writer and storyboard director on the show simultaneously, but around season 2, he became a storyboard artist exclusively until he finally left the show in season 6. So he spent a good decade on the show, but a majority of his footprint is only on the first season. Just thought that was interesting to point out. Like, certain SpongeBob crew members are more interesting to talk about than others, mostly due to what exactly their role on the show is. But about the story of this episode, it's not the most popular in the world, but it does have its fans, including me, who consider it one of the silliest, funniest stories of season 1, but it also has some detractors who say it's the worst episode of season 1, and I can see why. I can really, really see why. Because it is into torturing Squidward, making him feel miserable, making him do stuff he doesn't want to do. But at the end of the day, Squidward does have his moments. In general, I should talk about like the concept of an opposite day, because that's just fun to see in SpongeBob, no matter what way you slice it. Because SpongeBob is such a weird show that assessing what opposite is to these characters, it isn't realistic like our reality. It's an even weirder thing. Like, that's the catch with this episode. That's what makes it so memorable for me. Squidward thinking that the opposite of himself is SpongeBob. Like, this very quickly sets up exactly what he wants Opposite Day to be, and what eventually just bites him in the rear. This is kind of fun. Seeing Squidward try to be silly in front of SpongeBob, that rarely ever happens, ever 20 years on. But it is, yeah. But really, this episode does belong to SpongeBob and exactly how he handles Opposite Day, what Opposite Day means to him, and how he warps that into sillier and sillier meanings. That is the joy of Opposite Day as an episode, and I can kind of see how it doesn't appeal to certain people. But to me, as a comedy analyst, I do certainly enjoy this. I do certainly enjoy seeing SpongeBob take opposite to extreme opposites of each other. And I do really like that joke of his catchphrase, his new catchphrase on opposite day being, "I'm not ready." And here, for this little moment, Squidward's plan seems to be going pretty well. He has successfully manipulated SpongeBob into going back to bed and doing nothing. And we also see the very first time Gary does something other than meow. In this case, he barks like a dog, because dogs are the opposite of cats. Squidward's plan is now starting to crack as Patrick enters the picture. Of course, Patrick was at the start of this episode, but here's where he really becomes a character. And that's kind of fun to see, because he does sort of misconstrue SpongeBob's initial ideals of what is opposite. Like, at first he's confused and upset when SpongeBob calls him his worst enemy and all. And then, a few seconds into this scene, he decides that the opposite of breathing is not breathing, and that's something he can do. But seriously, guys, don't do that. You'll die in 5 minutes. I don't know exactly if this little joke here prompted kids to do no breathing contests, but those are the dumbest contests ever. Maybe it kind of scared them away from those because of how Patrick sounds during it and how his body twitches. It's personally my least favorite part of the episode, but it's immediately blocked out by this really good montage of SpongeBob and Patrick doing opposite things. And this is where the meaning of opposite day is starting to become changed, because now it's the opposite of only certain things, like backwards talking. And yeah, people before turning things backwards was very common. Like, of course, you had record players you could turn backwards, but the backwards talking was very fascinating at one point because you couldn't really hear what they were saying. But now the joke is even funnier because you know they were just telling to get to the other side, why did the chicken cross the road? But instead of the other side, it's getting to the opposite side. Basically, the transcript is, to get to the opposite side, I give up. Hey, Patrick. Oh, and this is my favorite joke of the episode. SpongeBob saying that Squidward absolutely condemning him as the worst neighbor in history is the nicest he's ever been to him. That cracks me up every time. Because it is sort of true in a way, especially at this point in the series. Like, this is pre-Christmas Who. This is only a few weeks after pizza delivery. And this is where the plot kind of snaps into pure gags. And I don't mind pure gags. I do kind of like this. In case you don't know, SpongeBob does the opposite of housework by dismantling his house. So Squidward does the opposite of being SpongeBob by cleaning it up. So SpongeBob gets confused with that and decides to become Squidward. And Patrick is completely zoned out. And SpongeBob completely twists and turns the facts until he finds a new idea for funny opposite shenanigans. And honestly, if this episode was completely aimless, then I can kind of see the detractors' point of view. But this episode does find a way, this little Squidward event horizon, as I like to call it, does sort of give the rest of the episode a purpose. It's not the greatest purpose in the world, but it is something. It does further the story. It does go into the Bikini Bottom realty thing. Another good thing it does is introduce the concept of characters imitating each other in the show, because it's just so funny to see SpongeBob imitate Patrick or Squidward or Mr. Krabs. And they do play with it a lot more in episodes like Gone and Mimic Madness, but this is a good start. Just having SpongeBob and Patrick imitate Squidward. SpongeBob doing a bang-up job because Tom Kenny's just inherently a good voice actor, and Patrick just saying he's Squidward, and as if that means something, as if he's playing Squidward, which is actually what kids do. It's really adorable to see Patrick do it. Oh, and here's the realty lady, played by Serena Irwin, who I think is the one who plays Karen. I could be wrong. Oh no, that's Jen Taylor. This is the one who plays SpongeBob's mum, I think. I'm not the genius on SpongeBob's voice actresses, but again, a lot of the voice actresses on SpongeBob are really good. They all bring their own unique take to the characters. Figured I'd give them some representation, no matter where it was. And I do really like this realty lady and how confused she gets at the never-ending swarm of Squidwards which are entering Squidward's house. And I do kind of like the angle that she is slowly realizing that this place does have bothersome neighbors, and she doesn't want to sell it because of that. Because that was one of her main objections. You can't sell a house if it has bad neighbors. And this episode's ending goes all out in showing that. And you can already see here that she's losing her mind at just how many Squidwards are popping up. There's 2 Squidwards now. Squidward is just such an inherently funny word when it's in silly situations like this, especially as a name of a stuffy neighbor. It's just the absurdity of the situation that really sells it. And I do really like this joke with the clarinet, and it all crescendoing into Squidward coming in, by which point the realty lady has just completely lost hope in selling the house and selling anything on Conch Street. This is a classic routine. I do like it. And for what Opposite Day lacks in like mimetic value and babysitting the template for some of the worst Squidward episodes, unfortunately, it makes up for it in being a really darn funny episode, because I was watching this earlier this morning and I was just cracking up because of how great it was. And I can honestly see how, if you've spent too much time thinking about like the later Squidward episodes, how this feels less special, how it feels less funny about the fact that he can't leave Conch Street because of SpongeBob and Patrick. At least the relationship, the chemistry between Squidward, SpongeBob, and Patrick wasn't that toxic back then. SpongeBob and Patrick were still kid-like, they were still entertaining, and they are today to an extent, depending on what episode you're watching. It's a complicated story. I'm going to wait until like after the movie, after all the changes are made, before I really compare and contrast this episode to the others, but it is an interesting look into... It is interesting to compare this to worse episodes, not because it's worse by comparison, but to see what SpongeBob did right so early on. And ultimately, that's kind of why I was happy to get to Nature Pants and Opposite Day, to see what SpongeBob was doing right, even in its most divisive episodes. So now my question of the week this week is, what's a highly regarded episode that you dislike? Remember, there's no wrong answers. Personally, I'm not very fond of Valentine's Day. I don't exactly know how strong that episode's holding is in the community anymore, but... So apologies if I brought it down a tad, but... Regardless, you have your opinions. You can say them in the comments. They might be featured next week. And with that, goodbye for now.